Hello, welcome to the Watson and Farley Williams webinar series, The Anatomy of an LNG to Power Project. Today's episode is Power Plants, Construction and Finance. My name is Nick Dingemans and I'm a corporate energy partner based in Singapore. Before we start, a number of housekeeping matters. Please note all microphones and cameras have been turned off centrally. Please keep them off throughout the webinar. For the Q&A, please submit your questions through the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be made available to all those who have registered for the webinar. Moving on to the next slide. For this episode, I'm joined by my colleagues Daisy East, Emmanuel Ninos and Heike Trishman. Daisy, Emmanuel and Heike are all based in our London office. Before we start this episode, a short advertisement for our next episode. In November, my colleagues Joe McGladdery and Gary Walsh will be discussing the construction, chartering and financing of floating regas storage units, FSRUs. Please watch out for the invitation towards the end of October, early November. Can we have the next slide, please? As we've said in our previous episodes, as the world transitions to net zero, LNG will be a key component of that transition. And LNG to power will be an important feature of the next 30 years as the electrification of the global economy increases. In episode 1, we looked at the evolution of LNG and how this has been facilitated by the emergence of floating modular construction, new sales models created by LNG aggregators and traders, and the creation of different pricing models. To successfully deliver an LNG to power project, an understanding of the full picture is required to be able to understand the multiple project-on-project risks involved. As you can see from these two slides, the full value chain is complex and runs all the way up to the upstream, incorporating sponsors, lenders, governments, contractors, and multiple other suppliers. While these slides overly simplify the complexity of the overall structures, they do provide an overall overview of the different market participants. On this slide, we are concentrating on the downstream portion of the overall value chain. As we have spoken about in our other webinar series, the area from the LNG SPA through to the power plant and the dispatch of energy to end users is our main focus, because this is where the concentration of project-on-project risk has emerged as a unique LNG to power project. The addition of an LNG sale and purchase agreement into a structure, as well as the reliance on regasification either through an onshore regas unit or an FSRU, changes the dynamic of a traditional gas-fired power project. My colleague Daisy is now going to take over and lead you through the issues that lenders have and how sponsors can address them. Thanks, Daisy.
Thank you, Nick. So yes, we're going to be looking today at the financing of these projects and particularly financing them using a project financing structure. So I thought I'd start with a quick overview of where the money can come from for projects of this type, and then we'll go through to look at how lenders look at the risks associated with them. So the money obviously can come from sponsors, and they can provide money on a base equity basis, so that what the base case model says it's going to cost, as well as for cost overruns, and we'll be talking in the extent to which cost overrun support may be required from sponsors as we go through. Commercial banks providing debt, other instruments such as hedging and letters of credit, and in projects in challenging jurisdictions or economically, it may make sense to bring in ECAs to support those banks' credit. Development finance institutions, again, they absorb political risk, some commercial risk, and they're usually direct lenders into these projects. And in tried and tested markets, operational projects are attractive to capital market investors and institutional debt providers because it's a steady revenue stream that is appealing to their return requirements. So moving on to what lenders look to see in projects. Lenders, of course, don't get an upside like equity do like sponsors do from optimizing their arrangements. They put in the principal and they get paid back the principal, hopefully, and interest and fees. So cash is king in terms of how they get paid back that amount, and they're very averse to risk affecting that cash flow. They'll look principally to the cash flow generated by the operation of the project, and therefore they're very focused on the certainty of how much it costs to build it, that it will be built on time and to the spec expected, and that the revenue and performance over its operating life will generate the cash flows required. This leads to this concept of the cash flow available for debt service, which is something that will be modelled over the life of the debt, looking carefully and closely at the ability of the project to service the debt. And ultimately, all project finance features derive from this cash is king point, largely because, as we've said, there is limited scope to look to the sponsors for any debt service coverage. There will be some, and we'll come on to a little bit later, the sort of completion support that will be looked at from sponsors. But once the project is operational, then it is down to the assets and the revenue generated by that project to service the debt. And that explains the very high levels of control that lenders will expect. They will also expect that the obligors are insolvency remote. They're not doing anything else than this project that the lenders have financed. And therefore, there's very little risk of something outside of the lender's control bringing insolvency challenges to the arrangement.
In addition to the points that Daisy's just raised, that there are two key phases of the project. There's the development phase and the operational phase. Lenders will undertake a thorough due diligence exercise to assess the project risks during both of these phases. The main aim of this due diligence is to ascertain and get comfortable with the level of certainty around various key elements in both these phases, namely during the development phase, certainty of time, i.e. when the project will be completed, the certainty of cost, which goes to the capex of the overall project, and ultimately the performance of the project. Likewise, during the operational phase, lenders will be looking for the certainty of costs, i.e. the certainty of the operational costs and any inputs such as any LNG inputs, as well as the revenue, i.e. through the power purchase agreement. The concept of certainty is a key feature and key theme that will arise and is a cornerstone of the bankability review undertaken by lenders during their due diligence process. As mentioned, lenders undertake this bankability review of the project contracts to assess risks. Lenders may be able to feed into these contracts if they haven't already been signed and therefore mitigate any perceived risks that they have assessed. However, ultimately, it's worth bearing in mind that the lenders won't be parties to these project contracts, and also there may be residual risks that they consider need to be mitigated, whether these arise due to the way that the contract's structured, in particular a LNG to power project, which will have multiple project contracts to, say, deliver the construction of the project, or simply because of the negotiating power between the employer and the supply chain, i.e. the lenders perceive that the employers adopted too much risk on certain elements. Therefore, lenders will look to mitigate these risks through finance documents and various other methods. This slide provides a high-level overview of these mitigants, and we'll return to this slide later on in this presentation once we've discussed some of the key bankability issues. However, the point to note is that any issues that the lenders do identify in the underlying project contracts may lead to restrictions on how the borrower, i.e. the project company, can operate, leading to a form of contractual inflexibility. The next part of this talk will be focusing on the key risks that lenders will look for in the project contracts and in the underlying project. The reason they do, as we mentioned, they do look for these risks is to ascertain the level of control that they will require over the borrower in the financing documents. This first slide provides a very high-level overview of certain key project risks, which to a certain extent will be present in most projects, not just in the gas power market. The reason for flagging these is the next following slides will focus on what we would view as the more critical risks and which will guide the lender's due diligence. Before looking at any individual risk, the starting point for any lender, and probably the equity as well, would be to understand the structure of the project being proposed. As Nick and Heike touched on in episode 1 of this webinar series, there are 3 general structures that can be adopted in a gas to power project, or a mix of these 3. Lenders will be interested in this structure, not necessarily because any of these structures won't be bankable. They all have their benefits and pitfalls for a lender. However, the structure will guide the lenders from potential makeup of the lending group. For example, some lenders do have restrictions on the type of project they can lend into, or the element of a project that they can lend to, in particular possibly export credit agencies, which Daisy will speak about later on in this presentation, but also the ultimate finance structure that the equity is proposing, because obviously the different projects have different structures that will require financing and or how the financing will operate, for example, the taking of security. It is worth noting that having equity having a very clear structure and a path to deliver this project will always be beneficial, purely from the perspective of facilitating the lender's due diligence and removing doubts about the equity's capability of delivering a successful project.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So then moving from the contractual structures through to the corporate structures, again, this slide was looked at in our first episode, and as with the contractual structures, one can see any variation on this theme, but essentially there are 3 broad types. That these integrated type, where your FSRU sponsors and your power project sponsors are in a common holdco vehicle, each which has 2 SPVs, one doing the power plant and one doing the FSRU. A cross ownership structure where there is some cross ownership between the 2 groups of sponsors, but not to the extent of a fully integrated structure. And a standalone structure where there's no common ownership. And the way that the financing would work is going to vary slightly according to the structure that you have in your corporate thing. So if we look here at the lending options overlaid onto those diagrams, you can see that, and again, there are variables. There's nothing laid in stone here. But lenders might, under an integrated structure, they might lend to a holdco that then on-lends to its 2 SPVs. Or the lenders might, as a single group of lenders, lend facilities to each of the 2 SPVs directly on a sort of cross-collateralized basis. Lenders in a cross-ownership basis might be lending to the power SPV that on-lends to the FSRU SPV, and a chain of security going back up towards the lenders there. Either of those will depend on where the content sits for ECA requirements, the extent to which lenders or ECAs need the debt to be at the SPV level rather than at a holdco level, local law requirements, the comfort that lenders have about potentially lending to a holdco and therefore being reliant on dividend streams coming up rather than having closer access to the revenue stream. All of those will affect the makeup of that. In a standalone structure, there are more likely to be 2 entirely separate groups of lenders providing specialist FSRU financing and power project financing. But because the 2 projects are so interdependent on each other, there will need to be some form of intercreditor arrangements between those 2 groups of lenders, giving each group the comfort that it would have the ability to step in and protect itself against a problem under the other financing. And that can be a lengthy thing to negotiate. And the balance, the tension in any big infrastructure project, but particularly in LNG to power, between the time it takes to negotiate something versus some other structure that may be easier, is always going to arise. So moving on, Emmanuel's going to look now in more detail at some of the risks.
Thank you, Daisy. The next couple of slides are going to focus on some more areas of consideration that the lenders will look to. A lot of these will be risks that will arise through the underlying project contracts that will be found in a project. Rather than focusing on a contract by contract basis, due to the fact that at this stage we're talking at quite a high level and according to the structure, there will be different project contracts. We have split the risks according to the key phases of a project, namely the development phase, the operational phase, and then a final slide on potential jurisdictional considerations. The point to note, though, is this is not an exhaustive list, and some of these risks may actually straddle a number of different phases of a project. The other point to note is that lenders will undertake all the due diligence, especially on the project contracts and the jurisdictional risks, on or before they've signed the finance documents, not necessarily when the particular contract is live. Therefore, this due diligence is often undertaken well in advance of the relevance of that contract. Finally, as you'll be aware, bankability is not a checklist with a right or wrong or a must-have position, but rather it's an overall risk assessment by the lenders on the entire structure of the project. As you'll see on the coming slides, the risks in the project contracts can be mitigated outside of the actual contract itself. However, what will also become apparent is a lot of these mitigants are the same mitigants. Therefore, the bankability issue that lenders get concerned about is more the amount of stress or over-reliance being put on some of these mitigants, which are, in lenders' minds, more of a contingency mitigant rather than necessarily the preferred optimal position. Therefore, the optimal position for lenders is for the risk allocation to be correctly dealt with in the underlying project contract rather than the sponsors adopting that risk and trying to mitigate it through other means. As mentioned, the first phase is the development or the construction phase. The reason the lenders care about the construction phase is that delays in the construction of the overall project can delay the receipt of revenues. It could lead delays or cost overruns can result in a higher capex, which will impact on the rate of return for the project. And any underperformance or the project not performing in accordance with anticipated levels can also impact the revenues. Of course, all of this will result in the debt service potentially being impacted. So it all reverts back to Daisy's original comment that the lender's main concern is cash is king. One key consideration in gas to power projects, which may not be as prevalent in other projects, is that there may well be more than one key construction, EPC, or ship procurement contract. This multi-contract procurement of the construction does erode the single point responsibility mantra, which lenders do try to look for in projects, and therefore does increase risk, not least because of the interface risk between the various contract packages, leading to lenders spending more time undertaking the due diligence to undertake their assessment. It's also worth noting that although this talk focuses more on the legal due diligence, there will also be a significant amount of technical advisor due diligence as well, running in parallel. Obviously, the first risk that lenders will try to assess is the risk of cost overruns. This will start from really basic sort of due diligence, which will be basically who are the proposed contractors. This focus will be on the track record of the particular contractor and also the credit rating of the contractor, i.e. the ability of the contractor to stand behind any guarantees or liabilities that it may be adopting under the contract, and also ultimately its track record in developing projects of the nature that they're being appointed for. Furthermore, the lenders will look to ensure that there is rigorous oversight by the employer over the contractor. Ultimately, they will be looking for an EPC contract, which means the contractor will be taking the risk of delivering the relevant works under their contract. However, they will require employers, i.e. the project company, to have rights to manage and supervise those contractors. In addition, the main concern will be ensuring that there is a clear lump sum contract price for the works. This means that the purpose of this is to minimize the scope for variations that may be claimed by the contractor or cost reopeners. Obviously the main risk, if this can't be achieved under the contract, is the risk of cost overruns. There are ways of managing this outside the actual project contract by the lenders, such as contingent debt facilities, sponsor funding commitments, and as mentioned at the beginning, these will be recurring themes as mitigants, and Daisy at the end of this slide will come on to explain a bit more of these some of these mitigants, which are more finance document in nature. The next risk will be delaying completion. Although there'll be a focus on the completion delay, i.e. when the project is to come online, in gas to power, the other delay that will be focused on is any key delays to key milestones, in particular those milestones that are milestones due to interface reasons, i.e. where there's integration between the two or more construction contracts delivering the overall project. The reason for this is that, coming back to cost overruns, a delay under one contract may result in cost overruns on another, because it may well lead to that other contractor having claims against the employer for delay and therefore cost. For any form of delay or time control, the lenders will look to ensure that there is a clear program of works with a clear allocation of responsibility in meeting those timing requirements. And of course, on the contractor, the lenders will look for a clear LD regime, liquidated damage regime, for any delay that's being incurred by the contractor. The main risk is, of course, is that the LDs often are not sufficient to cover all losses suffered by an employer for such delay, not least because these are often sized or capped against the value of the relevant contract, which obviously is going to be not equivalent to the overall capex of the entire project, especially when you have multiple construction contracts. Effectively, therefore, the LDs may not be sufficient for debt service. These risks can be mitigated through insurance, such as delay startup, ECA support, export credit agencies, and completion support from the sponsors. The next key consideration will be the actual performance of the plant. Again, lenders will look to experienced contractors, but not only that, if there's any licensed technologies being utilized on the project, lenders will look to see whether that technology is being wrapped by those contractors, but also, if it's not being wrapped, which isn't uncommon, especially for newer licensed technologies, what the track record of that licensed technology is and how much risk is being absorbed by the project if that licensed technology does not work. The other part of the performance of the plant is the compatibility with the PPA. Of course, ultimately the PPA is the revenue contract, and therefore lenders need to be comfortable that all project contracts will result in one thing, namely that the employers or the project company's obligations under that PPA can be discharged. Again, any underperformance of the plant will be thoroughly tested at completion, and no doubt there will be some form of liquidated damage regime that comes off the back of any underperformance. The main point to note, of course, again in a gas to power, is that the EPC contract structure may well be a multi-contract structure, and therefore there is no one EPC contractor taking the full risk on total completion. This could be managed through various interface agreements, but ultimately there will be some risk, residual risk, always sitting with the employer in this structure. Therefore, the key risk is an incomplete pass-through, insufficient liquidated damages being recoverable from the contractors, which ultimately leads to a reduced revenue if performance can never get back to the required standard, increased capex if additional works are being carried out to try and rectify that mistake and can't be reclaimed for reason against one of the contractors, and ultimately the liquidated damages may not be sufficient to cover the lost revenue. Again, the mitigations just with the delay mitigations are likely to be insurance, export credit support, and completion support. Moving on, a more general consideration, although quite prevalent these days in the construction phase, is force majeure. Lenders will assess the force majeure clause, not that they would be adverse to having a force majeure clause, but it's more to ensure that it's consistent throughout the whole supply chain. And the starting point for this would be to understand what the force majeure clause in the power purchase agreement is and ensure that force majeure clause is flowed down through the supply chain to the extent possible. The reason for this is the end goal of the lender is, should a contractor, who's the more likely party to trigger a force majeure claim, under one contract claim force majeure, the employer will be able to claim force majeure under any related contracts, including the power purchase agreement, and therefore ensure that force majeure is neutral to the employer. There's very few mitigations on force majeure, the main one being insurance probably, although some export credit agencies do give some coverage for force majeure. Finally, in the construction phase, although this is more of an operational risk, but it's included on this slide due to the fact that the construction contracts will deal with this risk, is defects. Again, the starting point is the lenders assessing the track record of the contractors and all the equipment suppliers to ascertain what their reputation is in the market and whether their particular technology or equipment does have any known issues, and therefore they can seek to address those within the contract. The main consideration, though, will be the length of the defects liability period. Obviously, the lenders would like as long as possible defect liability period because that provides coverage from the contractor on key risks, i.e. the performance of the plant. However, equity is often more adverse to extended defects liability periods because that does drive up the contract price or the price provided by the relevant contractor. And therefore there is then pressures on the viability of the project with the increased capex. Therefore, it's a bit of a commercial discussion and balancing act between the cost of such coverage and the actual coverage itself. Ultimately, defects, as I said, are more of a operational phase risk, but they can lead to delay through the shutting down of the plant for major maintenance or replacement, obviously additional cost, not necessarily for the actual defect itself, but any knock-on or consequential costs, because often defect provisions just restrict the obligation on the EPC contractor or the OEM to replace and rectify the defect rather than consequential loss. But ultimately, all these risks will lead to a loss of revenue, i.e. you're not performing under the PPA, and or even more concerningly, any penalties to be paid to the off-taker for the failure to perform. Again, the mitigants will be insurance, but also what lenders may look for is a reserve or life cycle account. And I think Daisy will speak a bit more about the pure finance mitigants on this slide.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So yes, I think this is a good point to talk about completion support in a little more detail. From the sponsor side, there's the tension between not making sure that this is a limited recourse or non-recourse financing. But on the other hand, as Emmanuel's outlined, there are always going to be cost overruns that can't be contracted away, the risk of delay, and more significantly, the possibility that liquidated damages that might arise, whether in relation to delay or whether in relation to performance, have come from further down the chain and don't pass up adequately to meet the actual implications at the power project end of the chain, whether that's liabilities under the power purchase agreement for being late to start export or not exporting sufficient, being late to take in deliveries of gas, or late to pay lenders to start the repayment profile. So in that situation, there's a cost to the sponsors in providing completion support, but there may be a greater cost in trying to get adequate LDs out of contractors, and a cost in time in terms of lenders really diligencing the risk of a cost overrun, the risk of a delay, and the implications of it. And it may be that the time implication of that, and potentially the cost implication of that diligence process, that the cost implications of trying to extract very high LD levels out of contract counterparties is actually better traded for completion support that covers that gap. And of course, strong sponsors may go for a significant amount of completion support, which gives them much more flexibility on the contractual matrix underneath, because essentially they get towards the stage of providing a wrap for that construction package. So there's always going to be a trade-off on the cost of providing completion support against really the cost of not providing it. To an extent where it's a cost overrun issue, lenders may be able to provide some form of standby facility that would cover that, although as I've mentioned previously, that may be expensive because by definition, once you're into a cost overrun facility, you're away from the base case, and lenders may not provide that at the same rate as their base case facilities being provided. So sponsor completion support is probably a necessary evil that is helpful in keeping the process moving along and managing the costs of the underlying contractual matrix.
Thank you, Daisy. So moving on now onto the operational phase risk. The main focus, of course, will be the certainty of the revenue stream, namely the power purchase price under the power purchase agreement. The lenders will therefore look to ensuring cost certainty, in particular the gas supply and O&M costs, but also certainty around the volumes of gas to be delivered, as well as the power to be provided to the off-taker, i.e. the volumes of any volume requirements under the PPA. The first assessment undertaken by the lenders will probably be a general market overview or market assessment of the particular jurisdiction or for that particular project. This is for two reasons. The first is obviously to assess whether they think that there is a viable project to be provided, but also in the event that the day one power project agreement falls away, what are the options for replacing that power purchase agreement, i.e. will it become a stranded asset in a worst case scenario where the power purchase agreement falls over. Depending on the market, there could be different structures on how the power purchase agreement is structured. It can be a single offtake agreement, in particular in jurisdictions where there's only one offtaker, usually a state entity, or there can be a combination whereby or combination of power purchase agreements where the a state entity and various other corporate or utilities, or just a mix of power purchase agreements. In each case, the lenders will want to assess what level of price certainty is, and that namely will be some form of fixed price, but also the currency in which that price is being paid. In addition, the lenders will look to the volume commitments, i.e. the amount of volumes that the off-taker has to take under the power purchase agreement, but also the amount of volumes that the project company is committed to providing to a particular off-taker. The reason for that is, especially if it is a volume PPA or some form of volume is included in the PPA, is there will be liabilities through liquidated damages for failure to perform, whether that's the taking in the case of the off-taker or the providing in the case of the power project company. And there are quite a few, if you look at purely the IPP, the independent power projects around the world, there are various models on these PPAs, especially in more emerging jurisdictions, and there are quite a few projects where models such as take and pay have changed over time from when the project was in, where there was project inception of quite a strong demand, and therefore there was potentially, lenders were potentially optimistic about the capacity of the market to absorb take and pay and the requirements for take and pay. But later on, as the power markets in that jurisdiction developed, the project companies were left exposed to the fact that the off-takers did not have to take set amount of volumes, therefore eroding the financial model of that project. The other point that lenders will look at is the compensation of termination, in particular the compensation that will be payable by the off-taker in the event that a PPA is terminated for off-taker breach. there are obviously certain, and the main assessment will be to analyse the grounds on which a offtaker can terminate the PPA, but also what payment the lenders will receive in the event of that termination. In particular, their aim will be to try and be kept whole. The other element, as mentioned, is the security of fuel supply. Again, this is basically the LNG that's being fed into the project, because lenders will need to be comfortable that in order to meet the obligations under the PPA, that there is a steady or there's a clear schedule of LNG shipments coming into the project. The first stage, therefore, is to ensure that there is a clear binding volume obligation of LNG to be supplied. Likewise, clarity around the price, in particular limited price reopeners, to maintain certainty around the cost. One point I didn't mention on the PPAs, but it's also relevant here, is also the term of both the PPA and those supply contracts. In an ideal world, lenders will want to be comfortable that the PPA and the supply contracts will be in place for the duration of the debt being provided, so that the base model can always be maintained. There is, in recent projects, there is some flexibility around that. However, that is still an emerging element of these projects. And I think, Heike, based on your experiences on LNG, there is one unique element of LNG, which is the actual scheduling of the LNG supplies, which you have some comments on.
Yeah, thanks, Emmanuel. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. Obviously, we haven't got that much time. So just to give a couple of examples, perhaps. The particular issues in LNG supply arise basically from its liquid and supercooled nature. So that is the fact that the LNG will be delivered in discrete ship cargoes and a continuous flow, as in the pipeline, in the gas pipeline, you will not have available. So you cannot just switch on a tap in order to have your supply. You have to wait until the next ship is coming along. And also LNG can't be stored as line pack as you would normally have with natural gas. So it will have to be stored as a liquid in a defined space. And if that's obviously full, then there is no more. And it boils off at all times, and that means it becomes gaseous again naturally. And so the storage tanks must be insulated, and therefore they're quite expensive. And so they are not very suitable for long-term storage as you would do with oil, for example. And also because it boils off naturally, it's rare to find that the LNG can be stored by floating cargoes on the seas until a market comes up again. So that would be often done with oil, but that's not available for LNG. So the cargo pipeline therefore has to be scheduled meticulously, and where there is an interruption or disruption upstream, i.e. on the liquefaction plant or the shipping element, or downstream, i.e. from the power plant, then obviously it's helpful to have a project company that has the ability of multiple supply sources, but also perhaps ample storage and certainly different demand markets, hopefully nearby, so that if cargoes are needed to be diverted, they can do that, or if an additional cargo needs to be contracted from somewhere else, they can also do that. And so experienced portfolio players, which we call aggregators, are very well placed to do this. And they are able to plug these demand gaps effectively and quite quickly. And obviously, if these aggregators can be brought in as a project sponsor, then they have an added incentive to get it right. So in that respect, the LNG is perhaps more flexible than a piped gas, because that will only have a source and a destination normally, and cannot be flipped around. But a quirky thing comes up, obviously, because the supply issue can actually pop up closer to the unloading facilities. So for example, where you have a narrow shipping channel or a river mound leading up to the FSRU, then obviously if that is disrupted somehow, blocked, then only storage at site will help, or the power plant can run on dual fuel, obviously. If that's the case, then that's helpful. So this can, for example, arise where the draft of the fully laden LNG ship is much greater than the available water depth of the channel. And that was, as far as we understand it, certainly the case in the V-Power project in Myanmar. But it can also arise where the waters around the FSRU are tidal, for example, so then you have to wait until the tide comes back in, or the monsoon times during monsoon times, the water channels may silt up quite quickly, so you have to dredge, and that will create more costs and also delays. So in Pakistan, for example, where we worked on a project, that means that the ships can only come in slowly because the pilot constantly has to figure out where the water depth is deep enough. And also the ships can't pass each other in the channels, so all the traffic in the port has to be halted. And also where the LNG tanker unloads, it requires a safety exclusion zone around it. And again, that will just delay the entire traffic in the port, which can become quite expensive because obviously other shippers may claim against the port, and the port will then try to offload that to the project. And so, as always, it's really, really important to understand your country risk, but also technically what you have in each case at the location, what you need to deal with.
Thank you, Heike. One point to note on both the power purchase agreements and the gas supply agreements will be that lenders will look to assess the counterparty creditworthiness and what credit support those counterparties will be providing. And this does raise questions on most power projects, in particular if there are government guarantees being given. Finally, just during the operational phase, the point to note is the reliability of plant performance and the certainty of O&M costs. Traditionally, again, the lenders would prefer a single O&M provider to wrap the entire O&M of the project. Again, just like with construction, though, there are multiple sort of elements to a LNG to power project, which may result in this being harder to achieve, or a smaller pool of O&M providers that may be able to do this, resulting in a much higher cost. However, ultimately, lenders will be looking for some form of availability to be passed through to the O&M contractors and liquidated damages to support their performance. Again, the mitigants to this will be the insurance for underperformance, ECA support, and reserve accounts where necessary. As mentioned, there's also going to be various in-country risks that will need to be assessed by the lenders. Although this is the last slide, in many ways it will be one of the first points that will be considered by the lenders, as these will be structural issues not necessarily related to the project, but more related to the jurisdiction. The first one is always going to be the money element. Are there currency exchange restrictions? Whether that is restrictions on taking currency out of the country, in particular, let's say often US dollars in some jurisdictions, whether there is a high, especially if the PPA is being paid in local currency, the currency fluctuations of the local currency, especially against what the currency of the debt, which we would assume will probably be in USD. And also the liquidity of the particular country. Some of these issues can be dealt with through an implementation or host government agreement, although there is increasingly less appetite by governments to enter into these types of agreements, especially if there are going to be a series of projects in a country. As a result, most lenders will accept or expect some form of FX risk to remain, and and therefore possibly some restrictions on offshore payments. This obviously impacts on the stable revenue stream coming into the project and therefore debt service payments. Mitigants could be to keep cash flows offshore bank accounts, ECAs, and where possible having USD as contract currencies or having a clear hedging structure to offset these fluctuations. The next point is political certainty as well. This covers two elements. The first one is the legal landscape of a country in which there is a clear route on procuring the relevant permits for a project, i.e. lenders will want to know how the permits are procured, what permits are required, and therefore be able to assess the status of those permits on the particular project. But also going forward, lenders will assess the risk of change in law and in particular expropriation risk within a jurisdiction. Because obviously frequent changes in the law can destabilize the financial model and the expected returns on a particular project. Again, these risks could be assessed through a host government agreement, but ultimately these risks, lenders will need to assess the strength of the host government agreement and what sorts of changes in law that would cover. Again, ECAs, insurance, and offshore reserve accounts may be some form of mitigation, but these risks are harder to quantify. Moving on, the dispute resolution of the various project contracts, not just in the jurisdiction, will need to be considered, especially for the interface contracts where there could be cross claims between contracts. But in addition to that, and the more relevant one where the PPA is with a state entity, is whether international arbitration decisions can be enforced within that jurisdiction or recognized by that jurisdiction for enforcement reasons. Again, there are limited mitigants for this. The most likely may be some form of ECA cover. However, this could well be a jurisdictional risk that remains with the project company. Finally, on the jurisdictional front, there are certain security considerations that need to be factored in, and I'll hand over to Daisy to speak to these.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Yes, so the local regime is going to be absolutely key in working out what the security package is available to lenders. In an LNG to power project, there may well be some security in between the parties and with certain counterparties as well that will need to be taken into account. But looking at it from the lender's perspective, they will want security of the physical assets, which will have to be under local jurisdiction, shares, which may be both onshore and offshore, and contracts, which again may be onshore, offshore. And lenders will want to look firstly at what security can be taken, and in some jurisdictions there are restrictions on who can take security over, in particular real estate. We see that in Saudi Arabia, for example. But there will also then be the question, once you've got around that, the question of how that security is enforced and whether it's enforced in a way that is easy and straightforward in realising proceeds appropriately for the lenders. Where either security is difficult in the jurisdiction or where enforcement is going to be difficult, lenders may well look to see as much of the asset base being offshored as they can. So ownership, for example, of a local project company through offshore holdcos in more approachable jurisdictions, giving share security outside of the local country. Keeping cash flows offshore, as Emmanuel's already mentioned, using the debt facility to pay the EPC contracts directly, using the power purchase agreement, if it will allow it, to be paid in US dollars direct into an offshore account, or requiring sweeping from an onshore local account into an offshore account as soon as possible. All to do with keeping money governed by security that is more readily enforceable by lenders in a way that works for them. Of course, there is always the problem that if your project company is a local is locally incorporated, then enforcement will need to be taken in country. And as Emmanuel said, you will then be exposed to what the local dispute resolution and enforcement of overseas judgments is. So we do see a range of structures there, but it will be very much down to what the local regime is as to what's acceptable. So moving then back to the slide on contractual inflexibility that Emmanuel picked up earlier in the webinar, and looking at remembering that the whole point here is preserving that long-term revenue, making sure that lenders understand what it's going to look like, and then that it's going to stay that way. Their ideal is contracted performance, so they know exactly what they're going to get at completion and when they're going to get it. Contracted revenue, they know exactly how long the PPA is going to be there for and exactly what's going to get paid under it. And contracted maintenance, so they know what it's going to cost, that it's going to work, and that the plant is going to perform when it requires. That's the ideal. That's not very flexible for the sponsors, and it does prevent sponsors or restricts sponsors from optimizing, which invariably will have a degree of risk associated with the potential upside of an optimized arrangement. When lenders and sponsors have agreed how contracted everything is going to be, then lenders will impose a limited flexibility on the ability to amend or change those contracts, because once they've got things in place, they then want to know that's how it's going to stay. They may agree a sort of limited regime for certain changes, for certain contract replacements, and so on, where there's a good market and a number of people who can provide that arrangement. But of course, amending and replacing contracts is not the only thing that can change the risk profile within the project. There will be discretions built into those contracts. For example, the ability to issue a taking over certificate or to call on a letter of credit. And those discretions are going to be subject to lender controls. Lenders will, in the diligence process, go through them with a fine-tooth comb, go through the project contracts with a fine-tooth comb, identifying every discretion and working out which of them they wish to have some degree of control over. And that control may be as little as simply tell us when you've done it. It may be don't do it without asking the lender's permission or getting input from a technical advisor or some other specialist advisor. Or in an extreme case, it may be a question of you will exercise this discretion if we instruct you to do so. That does create a tension between sponsors and lenders because it starts to interfere with the sponsor's relationship with their counterparties. And lenders are aware of this, but there will be some scenarios where that discussion has to be had. But the outcome of the discussion will depend on the strength of the sponsor and the context of the project. Related to this will be information covenants and the need for lenders to receive regular reports on the project, as well as ad hoc, when things arise, reports in the context of all projects now, but specifically those that have got export credit agencies and DFIs involved. There will be detailed and careful reporting on environmental matters, social matters and governance matters, and usually in a form prescribed by that export credit agency or that DFI or multilateral. Outside of the specific relationship between the obligors and the lenders will look to preserve the valuable contracts that are difficult to replace. And in an LNG to power project, that's going to be quite a lot of them. That's done through what's called a direct agreement, which is a tripartite relationship, but really it allows the lenders to impose a sort of standstill on a counterparty who wishes to terminate a contract or take some other adverse action under its contract because of a project company default, and allows a standstill for lenders to take a view on what they want to do about it. Will they step in? Can they cure it? Is it a default under their own financing, and therefore they're doing a general enforcement of security and they want to keep these contracts as a package to keep value in the asset? Of course, in a project-on-project structure such as LNG to power, you may well see direct agreements between different commercial parties and with the government similarly doing that. And Heike, maybe you want to talk now a little bit about what you've seen in Pakistan on this?
Sorry, yes, I can. Thanks, Daisy. So in the Pakistan project, it was a little bit quirky again. which is quite interesting because I have seen that also in the Myanmar project. So the government wanted this project done as a fast track, and that meant it had to be initially financed off balance sheet. There was no time to get lenders comfortable and all of that. But basically the operator company always wanted to refinance this through project finance. So all the documentation anticipated, and including direct agreements, needed to obviously be bankable right from the beginning. And so we entered into 2 sets of direct agreements, commercially initially, i.e. between the different parties without lenders. So I would say there was one set which was onshore facilities, and then there was one which was for the offshore facilities, i.e. the FSRU. And so the lenders then acceded later. They had like a little, placeholder in the agreements, and then they acceded later. Obviously, they had the right to comment, but I'm happy to say that they didn't find too much fault, and there were no significant amendments made later on. So on top of it, in order to keep the project going, the user of the FSRU and the onshore gas facilities, let's say, so that because it's a tolling agreement, the toller has the right to purchase the onshore facilities, and under very limited circumstances, even the FSRU. But obviously the price would have to keep the 2 sets of the lenders whole in each case, and that was certainly a point well made by the lenders. Thanks.
Thanks, Heike. So the last point I want to talk about on this slide is the waterfall, which we've talked about previously as being key to the calculation of the famous CFADs, the cash flow available for debt service. And the next slide shows you the very simplistic version of a cash flow waterfall, using what we'll for this purpose call the proceeds account, all the revenues that the project company, the obligors, receive, whether under the PPA, whether in the form of LDs from the O&M provider in relation to a lack of performance or a lack of availability, to the extent that it is a revenue compensation or a form of revenue, will go into a proceeds account. Lenders will require certain types of money to be put into a dedicated account. A good example would be insurance proceeds or expropriation compensation type proceeds that will be put into specialist separated accounts, so there's no mingling, and a particular regime will apply to how those monies are spent. But everything else goes into, for the sake of simplicity, a single proceeds account, and money is taken out as and when to pay operating costs, such as taxes, O&M costs, rent, that sort of thing. On repayment dates, which will be interest payment dates and will also usually be referred to as a calculation date, the maths is done on is there enough money left at that point to pay debt service. So that is your cash flow available for debt service. And as I mentioned, that will be modelled over the life of the loan to look on a period by period basis at the ratio of that cash flow available for debt service to the debt service. And if the numbers get too close for lenders' comfort based on their downsizing, their downside scenarios in the models, they may trigger an event of default. Somewhere slightly higher than that default threshold on the ratio will trigger a distribution lockup. Once the calculation's been done, on your repayment date, the monies are next applied to debt service, fees, ECA premia, payments of principal, interest, hedging payments. Usually there is a slight ranking, so fees and interest sit ahead of keeping principal current. Once that's happened, the next layer on that same day will be to usually to top up reserve accounts. Emmanuel mentioned reserve accounts earlier as a means of ensuring that when either in the context of debt service reserve accounts, if there isn't enough money to make debt service payments on a repayment date in the future, there is a little pool that can be used, or a maintenance reserve accounts or other types of reserve accounts against perceived exposures or cyclical overhaul requirements, for example, under the way that the O&M pricing and charging works. So those will need to be funded either to achieve a balance or to top them up after they've been used. Mandatory prepayments, normally those are paid using specific proceeds, such as compensation for expropriation, But to the extent that they do in a given project come from revenue, then they would get paid at that level. Now, reserve accounts and mandatory repayments may be the other way around. It very much depends on the project. Voluntary prepayments, which obviously are the sponsor's election, and then you look at the amount that's available for sponsors to take as distributions and shareholder loan repayments. Those will be subject to conditions if the distribution tests, so the debt service coverage ratios, aren't met. If there are events of default or other bespoke conditions, then that cash will remain locked up in the project. So that's just a quick guide to the waterfall and to the impact of these restrictions on ultimately the return to equity on a periodic basis. So moving then into how the risks that we've identified through the course of this webinar might be addressed by some of the funding sources that we look at. I think we've lost the slides. Bear with me for a moment. Emmanuel, are you able to put the slides back up? Let me see if I can put the slides up. So we were on this slide. We were revisiting where we'd got to with the where the money comes from, and it can come from the sponsors, as we said, or commercial banks, development finance institutions, or the capital markets once you get into the operation phase. How those sources might be used to mitigate the risks that Emmanuel has identified. Firstly, using sponsors that are experienced and committed sponsors. They know what they're doing. They've undoubtedly done this before. That gives lenders considerable comfort. As we've talked about, completion support to some extent from sponsors is a big risk mitigant and probably is ultimately helpful to sponsors in getting the deal done. We talked about reserve accounts, and I've mentioned here LCs. Reserve accounts are obviously a form of trapping cash in the project, and lenders are often open to the sponsors taking that cash out as a distribution and replacing it with a letter of credit provided by somebody of a suitable creditworthiness and absolutely non-recourse to the obligors. So only the sponsors are liable to service that letter of credit if it's called. Commercial banks provide money, obviously, and they can provide it in various forms. But they can also help with the due diligence process and the corralling of lenders by bringing in the experienced lenders in the sector to take on particular aspects of the DD and corral the rest of the lenders on that. So a bank deal, one bank is nominated to deal with the technical advisor and the technical DD, or the model auditor, or the lawyers in getting the documentation done, and that can speed things along. I mentioned that commercial banks typically will require some form of export credit agency cover for the political risk and some commercial risks. But of course, export credit agencies are limited in what they can provide in terms of the eligible content, which won't make up the entirety of the project. So there will be an uncovered amount of debt that is required, and there'll be a consideration as to whether commercial banks should be required to provide a pro rata portion of uncovered debt, or whether in fact there are local banks who are prepared to take that political and commercial risk in their host country and provide that local cover. Local debt.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you make your PowerPoint full screen, please?
Like that?
Perfect. Thank you.
So the local lenders may take up that uncovered portion and allow commercial banks to be really substantially entirely covered by export credit agencies. So the export credit agencies, as I mentioned, will be limited in their to providing cover for eligible content, and that goes back to the structuring discussion and making sure that the content is in the right part of the project for the export credit agencies to be covering the right thing, and very careful local law understanding is required as to local law requirements on content to make sure that that marries properly with the actual requirements of the export credit agency, and we have seen projects get into trouble on that. Export credit agencies usually provide a guarantee or an insurance policy, but they can be direct lenders. They absorb political risk and increasingly commercial risk, ranging from about 80% up to potentially 100% of the debt covered. Because they are the backstop for the major part of the debt, they drive the due diligence process and the risk analysis process, along with development finance institutions beside them, and the lenders are largely expected to follow. The export credit agencies are methodical, they are careful, and they are thorough, and it may be perceived that the process does not move as fast as it might with commercial lenders, but the rigor that they bring is usually beneficial in the end. They may not be so involved in the finance documentation process. Some of them absolutely do not take documentation risk, and to that end they expect the covered lenders benefiting from their guarantee or their insurance policy to ensure that the finance documents ultimately comply with the requirements of their cover. And that relates to, for example, how amendments work or how discretions are exercised. And as I say, development finance institutions can absorb political risk and take those elements away, and they'll usually operate alongside the export credit agencies because they are the sort of endpoint of taking the risk. So that's a whistle-stop tour through financing of LNG to power projects. There's an awful lot more that could be talked about. It becomes very specific to jurisdictions and to technologies in play and to the sponsors involved and the governments involved. But hopefully this is an interesting overview of the starting point. I'll hand over to Nick to look at what Q&A we may have.
Thanks, Daisy. That was really helpful. And Emmanuel. So we've got one question that's come in through the Q&A and a couple come in via email to me. The first question was about the prospects for floating LNG to power projects where it's a FSRP, which is a floating storage regas power, or it's a power barge plus an FSRU. And I think there is some potential for that. We understand there are about 6 projects in Africa where it's a power barge plus an FSRU. And we also understand that the Turkish group Car Power just launched their one in Indonesia, I think yesterday. So very specific piece of kit, very new piece of kit. And I think there's potential in specific circumstances where there's clear need for rapid deployment of power. So perhaps the Pakistan project, where if there was power needed rather than gas. Heike, what's your view on power barge or FSRPs?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. So Pakistan had one and it was easily being taken away because it was never paid. So if you have a power plant on the ground and you get never paid, then obviously that's a bit of an issue. So that's all good. And obviously you have, less land permitting issues and all of that. I do feel it has the feel a little bit of Prelude and the FLNG. So yes, infinite opportunities, but on a very limited space of a ship, you get a technology which gets really, really complex. And so I think we need to see whether this kind of technology, goes the FSRU way and becomes the way forward and the accepted technology also by lenders, or it goes a little bit the FLNG way. And, people are kind of dissuaded from using it currently because it's just too complex and too costly.
Yeah. Daisy, what's your view from a PF point of view?
I think that, again, it probably is more inclined towards the chartering vessel finance type of structure rather than a PF, because as Heike says, you can take the asset away and redeploy it somewhere else. I suspect also, I think they're very attractive to governments with a supply issue. Power barges have been around on a balance sheet finance basis for some time, probably with some kind of vessel finance in the background. But they're probably a short-term fix because, as Heike says, they're not big, so they're not going to be providing vast amounts of power, and therefore they're a short-term fix.
Yeah. Emmanuel, a view from your part of the world?
Probably echoing what Daisy and Heike say, I would say there's a scalability issue as to how large they can get, and then obviously there's always going to be a technology risk, like we've seen with various other technologies that sound good on paper, but ultimately until it's a proven technology, may struggle to get debt financing anyway.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very new technology in those terms. All right, and then a couple of emails with questions. Probably one for you, Heike. Looking at the tension you end up with between an LNG supply arrangement and those parcels coming in, and the risk of delivery there, and then the risk of offtake with power. What are the tools from an LNG point of view, how you mitigate that risk tension between those two?
Right. So we touched on that, I think, a little bit in episode 1, and briefly I also mentioned some tool. Obviously, if you have an aggregator, that company will be quite well suited to mix and match demand and supply, because they have infinite, or maybe not infinite, but a lot of flexibility in terms of supply sources and demand markets. But I think in addition, it's obviously good if your power plant is dual fuel, has the ability to store an alternative fuel on site, and also if in fact the gas hub, let's say, has outlet to other customers, so it's not just dependent on the power plant. That obviously is also very helpful. And storage is always good because it gives a buffer on both ends. If you run out of supply, you can plug into your storage, and if you run out of demand, you can store the LNG for a while, but it's not a long-term fix. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think contractually as well, I think we talked about this in episode 1, there's if you look at the Java 1 project, the power off-taker was actually the LNG purchaser, and then they tolled the LNG through the FSRU and power plant effectively. I mean, it was sales agreements and power purchase agreements, but you concentrated the LNG risk and the offtake risk in the same entity. So that's another contractual tool you can use. Emmanuel, you talked a lot about multiple contractors and sorts of risks that came up. Question around where you do have those multiple contractors, what are the approaches for managing the risks, sponsor contractor, but also contractor to contractor? How are you seeing that?
Yeah, so again, it's not an unusual risk in a number of different other sectors as well. And the usual ways of doing it is either you have a strong sponsor group managing the project company effectively, which can demonstrate that they have the expertise in managing the interfaces and coordinating the various contractors, or you have a strong project manager. Obviously, all of these come at a cost to the project company. The other way of doing it is, if it's only a limited number of main contractors, to have some form of overarching interface agreement between them to at least de-risk the risk of interface problems arising between the contracts. Obviously, contractors are more adverse to that because it's them absorbing that risk. But depending on the technology and the relationships of the parties and the premium presumably you would pay them, that's the other route to doing it.
Yeah, and I guess again there's a corporate contracting tool which actually is to bring the contractors into the equity as sponsors. So if you look at the BP Siemens projects in Brazil, both BP and Siemens are part of the mix. BP's supplying the LNG and Siemens providing equipment. So that, I get that's another mitigant. Daisy, last one for you. One of the contractual tools we're seeing in other parts of the oil and gas value chain is international oil companies and other sponsors coming in and providing debt. So I'm thinking of the RBL world here, where IOCs will offtake the product, but they also provide debt. When I can see that as a tool in LNG to power, what would the impact be in the intercreditor arrangements? What's the position of a debt providing sponsor in that arrangement?
The typical treatment there is that a lender that is in the sponsor group is disenfranchised, so they don't get a vote, they don't get a say. There may be various forms of subordination. They may be subordinated on enforcement. So in the ordinary course, they may get paid pari, but if you get an enforcement, then they'll rank behind the other lenders. But it really depends on the debt makeup of the project, the extent to which that debt provided by the by sponsors is within the sort of senior debt capacity of the project, and how it fits in with that debt equity ratio, as to the extent of that subordination. But certainly they would be disenfranchised, and they'd not be able to join lenders in making, and ECAs in making decisions about, for example, taking enforcement action.
Yeah, okay. But you can still see it as a valuable tool in enhancing where maybe your off-takers have strong credit.
Yeah.
So that's it for the Q&A. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Our next webinar series is in early November, and that's on FSAU's construction, chartering and financing. Thank you to our speakers, and thanks to the Watson Farley events team for pulling this all together for us. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.